Biggles Adventures in Time is a science fiction adventure released in 1986, directed by John Huff.
American businessman played by Alex Hyde-White. He's called Jim Ferguson, and he works at what's like a TV dinner company or something. It's never quite established exactly what they do. Something to do with TV dinners anyway. That's kind of superfluous to the plot, to be honest. As quickly after the start of the film, he's sucked back in time to 1917, where he meets James Bigglesworth, who was a character in almost 100 books written between the 20s and the 60s. He originally started out as a World War One pilot, and then as the time went on and the stories moved through time, he became a Second World War pilot and various other adventures. None of them ever involved time travel, though. So yes, old Jim sucked back in time from the 80s back to the First World War, where he meets Biggles and rescues him from his just crashed plane. He jumps back and forth through time several times throughout the film, and it turns out that he's Biggles' time twin, whatever one of those is. Biggles' former commanding officer, played by Peter Cushing, kind of knows him because in one of these jumps back in time, he gives Biggles his business card, which he then gives to Peter Cushing. So he knows who he is. So he comes to find him to help him on his adventure. This adventure involves a sort of German secret superweapon, which could turn the tide of the war in their favour. So it's up to Jim and Biggles to save the day through time shenanigans and lots of dogfights.
Yes, Biggles. So next in our month of time travel films, this little unknown.
I think if you're a kid of the 80s, you probably heard.
Yeah,
of it.
If you're a kid of the 80s,
particularly in the UK, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's one that I saw this as a child. I loved it when I was a child. Haven't seen it for many years, and I thought, well, it's a time travel movie. Yeah. I rewatched it, but I still loved it. I loved it.
It does have some fun stuff in it, to be fair.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty daft, but it's just a good old romp, I think. Much in the vein of, and in fact I was reading that it kind of reminds you of like a little bit Indiana Jones, like you said. Yeah. I mean, it started out life as a story, as a kind of swashbuckling type tale of this pilot flying around the sky saving the day, much like something like Indiana Jones and a lot of those old tales that people like Spielberg and George Lucas would have grown up on. And this, of course, is the kind of UK version of some of those ones. And in fact, this apparently started out life as more in the vein of films like Raiders of the Lost Ark. But then, of course, in 1985, Back to the Future came along, and they went, we know what we can do with this film. We'll turn it into a time travel adventure.
Well, I don't know how true that is, because if you think about it, Back to the Future came out in 1985. Biggles was filming in 1985. So, and Back to the Future was, I'm not sure, I think in the UK it came out towards the end of the year. I think they filmed quite early in 1985. So I would question whether that was really the case. I don't know, because it was a bit, they couldn't change it in the middle of filming.
Yeah, and also because when I read it, I thought, well, it's really, I mean, it's a time travel adventure, but it's nothing like Back to the Future, and it doesn't play with. Really, no. And as we've mentioned, I think a couple of the other films that we've done in this month, it doesn't really play with the mechanics of time travel. I mean, Back to the Future is kind of the classic one, and we've mentioned it before. We didn't really go in depth with Back to the Future, but out of all the time travel films that exist, apart from, Primer's maybe another one. There's not many of them that really play with those mechanics. When I say mechanics of time travel, is that whole going back in time, changing something that happens in the present, coming back to the present, and it actually being different, and whether that be a good thing or a bad thing. There's stuff in here that doesn't really, things get changed, but they don't really have any.
I mean, they kind of say, if we don't destroy this super weapon, then the future will change, but. It doesn't really make any sense.
No, it doesn't make any difference, and it doesn't really make any sense. It just seems to be there, because, let's drop time travel into this film.
I mean, I think, the main reason is because obviously Biggles in the UK was quite well known, but everywhere else, not really. So it was, it's more of a, as often happens with, British properties, they, when they're converted into films, they often shoehorn American characters in there. So it's more appealing to American audiences. So they've got some, a hook into it. Because if it's entirely British, I'm not saying that's the case these days, but certainly back then they needed some sort of way in, and that would usually be by casting an American actor or changing a character into an American, or something like that, just to give it some sort of recognition in the US. Compared to the original stories of Biggles, it's, if you were a Biggles fan, you potentially would go, what the hell's this abomination? Because it bears for a little resemblance to those original stories. I mean, there are characters in there that were in the books, but yeah, the whole time travel stuff is just completely tacked on for that reason.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. It's very 80s. It's one of those 80s films that really feels 80s. Films like Mannequin and, I don't know, Crocodile Dundee, those kind of films where everyone, I know obviously any film in the 80s was set in the 80s and looks like the 80s, but there are some that really just have the 80s dripping off them, down to the fashion and the music. I mean, the theme tune in this, Do You Want to Be a Hero? It's amazing. It's just so, it's so tacky. It's so much fun, and it's got that classic kind of 80s sound. That kind of, that synthesized 80s sound to it.
I'd say it's maybe slightly overused.
Oh, totally. It's completely overused. Exactly.
This again?
What's interesting about this film, I loved it when I was a child. And some films, when you grow up, you're like, oh, they don't really work anymore. But this one still works. It
does have a bizarre charm. Yeah, I agree.
And all the actors seem to be having a good old time. And although I have to say, I kept expecting Biggles to turn around and say, "Smoke me a kipper, I'll be back for breakfast," because he completely reminded me of Ace Rimmer from Red Dwarf. I think if you're British, you probably, and you know this film, you probably got a soft spot for it because it's there's a wonderful moment at the beginning, and like you said in your intro, there is some amazing. We're not in the era of CGI here. There's some amazing aerial combat going on. Yeah. So the bad guy in it, this Eric von Stalin, I think he's called.
Stalhein. Or Stalhein.
Stalhein.
Eric von Stalhein.
Eric von Stalhein, he wears this mask. I suppose it's a bit like, is it the Baron? That was like a famous German.
Yeah, I mean, I think he was a character in the book as well, and he was based on a real German pilot.
But there's this amazing scene where he jumps into his plane. And he kind of goes down the runway, and the camera is on the wing of the plane.
Yeah, I rewound that because I thought, wow, that was really good.
I went back a couple of times as well, and the music kind of kicks in as he takes off. And then they have this amazing kind of chase sequence with these planes flying through. And I think we spoke about this when we did another time travel film, actually, The Final Countdown, and there's all those dogfights going on in that. And in fact, in that one, similar to this one later on in the film, you have modern day jets flying with Japanese, the small, can't remember the name of the planes, the small ones that the Japanese
Zeros,
had.
I think, wasn't it?
Zeros, that's correct. And it's really exciting watching that because it's real. They're up there doing that. And the same within this one, there's some really great moments where those pilots, they're in those planes and they're flying them around and it's like, oh God, they're getting a little bit close. And there's this wonderful scene where they go through like a forest. And they're quite flying low to the ground. It's like, oh my God, that's
yeah. I mean,
close.
Some points they're like a couple of foot off the ground.
Yeah, very close.
And I mean I think that's its biggest strength is those aerial sequences. I mean, it's a shame there's not more of them. But I mean, they're really well done. And there's one shot where it looks like Alex Hyde-White is in that passenger seat. Because it certainly looks like him, and he's flying around. I mean, he's not at the controls, and the guy at the controls has like a scarf over his face, so you can't see him properly. So that's obviously not Neil Dixon as Biggles, but it definitely looked like Alex Hyde-White. So they got the actors up there, and they were spinning around and everything. He looked a little bit ill.
It's got some good stuff in there. It's flawed. I mean, before we started filming, you were like, you had a few things to get off your chest about it. So please be my guest.
I think, some of it feels a little bit cobbled together. I mean, there's William Hootkins is in it. If you don't know him, he's in Star Wars as Porkins, the X-Wing pilot. He's in Raiders as well at the start as one of the, I think he's a CIA guy that sort of recruits Indy to go and look for the Ark. He's in Hardware as well. Yeah, he's in there as like one of Jim's colleagues. He works with him, but he's a real dick. And he just, at the start, he just seems to be there just to be annoying. He doesn't really serve any purpose. Sort of half an hour into the film, Jim goes to London obviously to see Peter Cushing, because he realises he doesn't know what the hell's going on with his time travel business, and Peter Cushing clearly does, so he goes to see him. And William Hookins' character and Debbie, played by Fiona Hutchin, who's like Jim's sort of colleague / girlfriend, they both go to London. I mean, clearly, I don't know who's doing any work at this company. There's 3 of them have buggered off to London.
The guy they left behind, the one that wanted to go, he's the one who did all the work.
Yeah. When they arrive at his hotel room, just as he's sort of transported back forward in time. And so they hear sort of a kerfuffle through the door, and they knock on the door, are you okay? Are you okay? And as they're doing that, he kind of sidesteps across the frame, out of shot. Okay, that was a bit of a weird move. And then, but he's got a hat on that sort of matches his coat. And then Jim opens the door, and we see a shot through the door outside into the hallway. And they're both stood there, and Chuck suddenly has lost his hat, but he's holding something. And I had to rewind it. What is he holding? And it looks like some sort of Halloween mask. And it's like, what is that about? And he carries it into the room. And then that's it, it disappears. It's never seen again. But you rewind it and pause it, it is definitely some sort of monster mask. And I'm like, what the hell's going on there? It doesn't make any sense. And then also with his character, he's in the hotel lobby, because they don't really believe, his time travel story. Because when Jim opens the door, he's in a nun's habit, so and he's got a machine gun on the chair in his room. So they're like, what is going on? So they don't really believe what's his time travel tale, as you probably wouldn't. But Chuck, when he's down in the lobby of the hotel, and he suddenly spots a payphone, and the expression on his face makes you think, he's just he's just had a brilliant idea. So he picks up the phone and phones the switchboard of the hotel, and says that he's Jim's psychiatrist. I've got one of my patients is staying in your hotel, and he's very ill, and you need to get an ambulance and some men in white coats, basically, to come and pick him up. And you're like, right, okay. And then he goes to the reception, and the guy says, oh yes, the doorman has got a package for you. I'm like, what? What is he talking about? And he goes outside, and then he's suddenly surrounded by police and SAS guys or whatever, and have guns shoved in his face.
Yeah, no, you're right. Yeah,
and it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And then we don't see him again until right at the end of the film.
There is that bit near the beginning of the film when they're in their office in America, and he's got that book, doesn't he? And he does talk about people having having a break, having a mental. It's just because obviously people in business who have stress, and then they have these nervous breakdowns, and they go off and do crazy things. So there is a little slight mention of kind of psychosis, but no, you're right. He does kind of vanish, and it's almost like
there's some whole subplot that was obviously just cut out.
Yeah.
But why they left those bits in?
Yeah.
Because they don't make any sense.
And they could have been cut out completely, and they wouldn't have affected the film.
Yeah, you wouldn't have missed
all,
anything. No. It was completely bizarre.
I mean, even the girlfriend is kind of she's only really there for one moment when she goes back with him.
She doesn't have a great deal else to do. I don't know. Obviously, it was low budget, so they worked with what they could, and it doesn't.
I don't know. I mean, it can't have been that low budget. All the money they must have pumped into all the aerial stuff.
Well, that's the thing. I think most of the money went on that. I suppose
that's where it went. Yeah, exactly.
So, I mean, there's some great stunts. When they're running across the rooftops, they're really high buildings, and there's obviously stunt guys doing that, and they do a massive jump, which again looks ridiculously high, and you think, why? I mean, clearly the stunt guys are jumping into mats or boxes or whatever. But if they, the actual characters are meant to be jumping onto this roof, but it's 30 foot, and it's they break their legs. So it's I know I'm picking stupid holes in it.
You're picking the tiniest of holes.
I know.
You're picking the kind of holes that we wouldn't have picked when we were 10 years old. When we just
no, exactly. When you're a kid, you don't notice these things.
It's swashbuckling. I mean, it's lots of kind of over the top set pieces, great plane sequences. There's a great moment with a helicopter and a train, which is quite cool.
That's it. Yeah, I mean, we talked about the flying sequences and the helicopter stuff, in the 80s, and obviously the helicopter gets transported back in time. Spoilers.
Yeah.
But yeah, all the helicopter stuff again is fantastic. Really great pilot work there, because they're doing all sorts of stuff. There's a guy hanging off the helicopter, and it's all really, really great stuff. So again, that's probably what a lot of the budget went on.
And I think, like I said before, I think that, the car. I mean, this is Peter Cushing's final film, we should say. And he's clearly relishing just being, just being what he's being in it. I mean, he doesn't have a huge amount to do. I suppose he was quite. I mean, I don't know. It was almost 10 years till he finally passed away. He passed away in the mid-90s, and he's looking quite frail, I think, by that point. I mean, like I said at the beginning, I mean, whether or not what I said was true or not about it kind of becoming a time travel movie after Back to the Future, we're not sure about that. But I quite liked the idea with the time twins. I thought that was quite cool. I mean, they don't really go that far into the time aspect of it. They never really explain why it's happening. It just seems to be happening. But I quite the idea of the time twin thing, because it kind of reminded me a little bit of the twin town thing we have in this country. You know, where you have a town which then it has like a twin in Europe somewhere, and it kind of seemed to be a little bit like that, but for time travel. So I thought that was there was some interesting ideas here. There's actually there's one moment in here which is actually quite gory. Just one
I mean,
shot.
that's the bit I remember as a kid. I knew there was some sort of face melting thing going on. I couldn't quite remember what, but yeah, it's quite a bit much for a PG. I thought that was the bit that whole scene with the weapon and the little igloo thing that they hide in. That was the bit I remembered, and because that's filmed at Beckton Gasworks, which the following year Kubrick used for Full Metal Jacket.
I think this film looks great. It's quite daft. It looks great. The actors are having a whale of a time. It's very comic book. It's also a little bit Doctor Who, and maybe that's kind of the British influence there. I mean, even Peter Cushing himself played Doctor Who in a couple of films back in the 60s, didn't he?
Yeah.
I mean, the director, John Huff, I mean, he did a lot of work on the Avengers, and then he went off, he famously did a few of the Hammer horrors, he did Twins of Evil, Legend of Hell House. And he did some stuff in America as well. He did the film, Peter Fonda's film, Dirty Mary, Crazy Larry, which is a great kind of car chase movie. So he had quite a successful career back in the 60s and 70s. This is kind of, I think he also did The Howling 4, straight to video. So he's had an interesting career. He knows his stuff, clearly. I think I really enjoy it. And I think it's not a great time travel movie. Did you spot there's a notable link to another time travel movie?
Old Marcus Gilbert as von Stalhein. I looked at him. I thought, where is he from? And I couldn't remember. Yeah, and I had to look it up. And of course, he's Arthur in Army of Darkness. So
yeah, I think good fun little film. Do you have it on DVD?
I've got it on DVD. I mean, I picked it up. I think at work, they did some charity thing, and people were encouraged to bring in books and DVDs and CDs and all sorts of stuff, and to sell, to give the money to charity. I mean, it was several years ago, and I thought, Biggles, I remember that. So I grabbed it for like 50p or whatever the person wanted it for, but I hadn't watched. I'd never actually watched it. As far as extras, it's probably one of the better versions. Probably the best version you can get. It's got a music video on it, which has got Peter Cushing in it. So probably that was his last sort of filmed thing that he made, because he probably made that after the movie. Yeah, it's got a sort of 25 odd minute making of with interviews with the directors and actors and stuff like that, and behind the scenes stuff. And then it's got do you remember Saturday Superstore that was on in the 80s with Sarah Green?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I do. Yeah.
It's got a short segment on that, but I thought it was going to be like, they were going to have somebody who was in the film interviewed or something, but no, it was some kid that had gone to see it, and she was asking him what he thought of it. He loved it. He said it was 9 out of 10. So if you were that kid who was on Saturday Superstore, do you still think it's a 9 out of 10?
Yeah,
I'd love to know.
We would,
because it's not. Let's face it. It's fun, but it's not a 9 out of 10.
It's pretty close to 9 out of 10. Come on. 8 out of 10 at least.
If you say so.
I
Were
loved
you that
it.
kid?
I loved it. No, it wasn't. Anyway, go on. Carry on with the extras.
And it's also got a Blue Peter segment from 1986 as well.
What a great DVD!
So
it's so British.
And that was, that's the Blue Peter. I mean, if anyone outside the UK, Blue Peter was basically a sort of kids, sort of early evening, sort of a magazine show, I guess, wasn't it? Yeah. Which showcased all sorts of things. Sometimes the presenters would go off and do skydiving and rock climbing and all sorts of other crazy things. Other times they would make toilet roll, paper mache, bowls and Tracy Islands and things like that.
Here's one I made earlier.
Yeah, here's one I made earlier. Yeah, exactly. So they used to get up to all sorts of weird stuff. This is the era that I remember with Simon Groom and Janet Ellis and Peter Duncan. It's really cringy. And it's almost like an advert, because when the show opens, Peter Duncan is sat there surrounded by Biggles posters and books and all sorts. There's barely room for him on the set, to be honest. There's so much Biggles stuff. It's like, how much is the studio paying the BBC for this? It was ridiculous. And then there was a competition where you could go to the premiere where Prince Charles and Lady Di were going to be there. And I have a vague recollection of perhaps entering that competition. I can't remember.
Oh, I love it.
But
I love how you.
I didn't win anything.
I love how you seem to enjoy the extras on the disc more than the actual film. This is a classic.
It was a sort of 15-minute cringe fest, to be honest. But you know, it harks back to my youth. I remember, watching Saturday Superstore and Blue Peter. I probably watched that episode when it was on.
I mean, that is directly our youth, because we were. I mean, this came out in '86, so we were both kind of 9-10 years old. So that is straight out of that is our past right there. So that was Biggles, and as always, if you enjoyed the video, let us know in the comments below.
Hit the subscribe button over there, and don't forget to push the bell for notifications. There's other videos to check out over here. Come and find us on various social media platforms, and join us again next week for another video.